Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to look at the case of Jack the Ripper, which you probably already know since it has been referenced everywhere over the past few years. So much so that it's likely you know the name, but not exactly what he did or whether his identity was ever discovered. So let's talk about all of that. It's a long video, but in my opinion, the topic is worth it. So up there, the one that's on screen, you can see the rest of my cases. Here are my social media links in case you want to follow me. And without anything else to say, let's get started. To understand this case before talking about the crimes this killer committed or the many theories that exist around him, it's necessary for us to focus on the context in which he ended the lives of 5 women in the East End of London in 1888. Since then, and even before that, the East End district gained a reputation for being home to the most marginalized sectors of society. It was commonly said that only the immoral and the criminals lived in that area, those who were just a little better than wild animals. And although it's true that some places in the area were somehow controlled by different criminals, most of the neighborhoods in the district were overcrowded with poor people. Starting from 1882, London and England in general had become the destination for thousands of immigrants who were fleeing their countries in search of greater safety and also more job opportunities. Unfortunately, the flow of low-income immigrants was so large that there weren't enough jobs for all of them to get one. At the same time, the lack of jobs and, in general, the poor economic situation in London led to neighborhoods like Whitechapel having an ever-growing population, and above all with even more needs, which forced many people to turn to crime, and many times to prostitution, which was practically the only way women had to make money. Just to give you an idea, according to police records from 1888 in Whitechapel alone, there were 62 brothels and at least about 1,200 women working as prostitutes. In recent years, Whitechapel had become an increasingly troubled neighborhood, with the increase in brothels, taverns, and bars that sold alcohol at very cheap prices had also started to open. This led to people always being drunk on the streets of that neighborhood, and as a result, there was a lot of violence in the area. This violence was often due to crimes such as muggings and robberies, or even sexual assaults. But at other times, it was due to fights between drunk people that even ended in death. In that context of violence, poverty, and overpopulation, several complex homicides occurred. However, the most notable ones were those that happened during demonstrations and protests. The worst incident occurred in 1887 due to the economic situation, when, on Sunday, November 13, the Radical Federation organized and called for a demonstration against the national coercion against Ireland. At that demonstration of approximately 10,000 people, 2,000 police officers and 400 soldiers were ordered to suppress those present. The brutality of the force was extreme and resulted in 2 deaths and hundreds of injuries. Despite the brutality of the force's actions, the episode known as Bloody Sunday did not bring about major changes in people's perception of Whitechapel. The events that took place the following year and the constant media coverage of the crimes committed by Jack the Ripper ended up cementing the idea of that neighborhood and the entire East End district as a terrible place, a place full of darkness where monsters were hiding. Going back to Jack the Ripper, this serial killer was credited with the murders of 5 women. But the truth is that they were not the first to be found dead on the streets of the East End, in that district where violence was an everyday occurrence. It was not uncommon for the London Metropolitan Police to find lifeless bodies on the streets of different neighborhoods. Both men and women would be found in the streets of that part of the city, either dead or, in many cases, seriously injured. Violence, even at that level, was not a surprise to either the authorities or the population of the East End. However, starting in April of 1888, the discoveries became much more macabre. The first victim of this day of violence was Emma Elizabeth Smith, a 45-year-old woman who had been living there for a year and a half, in what was then called a common lodging house. Emma was what, in those days, was known as an unfortunate woman. A woman who engaged in prostitution independently, meaning she offered her services and practiced them on the street. Unlike those who worked for a brothel that had rooms entirely dedicated to that, or other sex workers who took their clients to their own home. If being a prostitute was already dangerous, being one like Emma was even riskier. According to the owner of the inn where she lived, several times she had come back beaten by one of her clients. However, despite these incidents, the woman always went back to prostitution, driven by her strong dependence on alcohol. Addiction that, in the first place, had led her to those circumstances, since because of her alcoholism, she had lost the little she owned. And her children, now adults, had decided to cut all ties with the woman. On the afternoon of Monday, April 2nd, 1888, Emma left Mrs. Mary Russell's inn to go to one of the nearby taverns. It was part of something she did every day. She would settle in at some bar and drink until night fell. That's when she would go out onto the street to look for a client. In the early hours of April 3rd, one of the colleagues who worked on the same street as Emma saw her talking to a man who was wearing dark clothes. The night hadn't been very good for this other woman, named Margaret Heiss, so after a while she decided to go back home while Emma continued talking to the same man she had been seen with earlier. A few hours later, between 4 and 5 in the morning, Emma walked back to the inn where she lived. She was in a terrible state, her face was bleeding, and, according to what the owner of the establishment could see, the woman had a deep cut on her ear, as well as several wounds on the lower part of her body. When she asked her what had happened, the woman explained that 2 young men had stolen all her money. At this, worried about the condition in which her guest had arrived, Mrs. Russell had to insist on taking her to the hospital. And after a few attempts, she managed to convince Emma to accompany her to the London hospital, located about 15 minutes from where they were. She was attended by Dr. George Haslip, who determined that, in addition to the visible cuts, Emma had been struck with a blunt object. In other words, an object had been inserted into her vagina with such violence that her peritoneum, the tissue that lines the abdomen and most of the organs in that area, had been ruptured. While the doctor was treating her, Emma was able to give a few more details about what had happened. Around 1:30 in the morning, after her friend decided to leave, Emma decided to change locations. She was already passing by the Whitechapel church when a group of men approached her, trying to avoid trouble. The woman crossed the street, but they had no problem following her along Osborne Street, where they finally cornered her to assault and rob her. Before leaving, the 3 men she described as young attacked her with a weapon she couldn't identify because of the darkness. Unfortunately, Emma's injuries were extremely serious, and shortly after being admitted to the hospital, she fell into a coma due to severe peritonitis that would eventually cause her death. On the morning of April 4th, although given Emma's own testimony, it is unlikely that she was a victim of Jack. The Ripper was the beginning of what the police would call the Whitechapel murders, to which the 5 officially recognized victims of this serial killer would soon be added. On August 7th of that same year, another prostitute was brutally murdered in the same area where Jack claimed his victims. We're talking about Martha Tabram. Just like in Emma's case, Martha had a serious drinking problem which affected her life and her personal relationships, until it left her sunk in misery, having to resort to prostitution to support herself. On the night of Monday, August 6, Martha decided to go out on the streets to make some money, even though it was pouring rain. The truth is, not much is known about how her last night alive went. But the next morning, this woman was found on the stairs on George Yard Street. She had been stabbed 39 times, although it was missing certain details to match the canonical 5. The lack of a clear motive and the area where she was murdered make many consider her case as Jack's first homicide, although it was never proven. The first victim of what is now known as the canonical 5, or the proven homicides committed by this serial killer, it was Mary Ann Nichols, although her maiden name was actually Walker, Polly, as her family and friends called her. She was born on August 26, 1845, near Fleet Street in London, being the second of 3 children born to Edward and Carolyn Walker. There is little information available about her early life. The little we know about Mary is that in her teenage years she had a brief romance with a boy her age named Thomas Stewart Drew, which ended in 1863 when she met William Nichols, a man who worked in printing. The love between them was immediate, and less than a year after meeting, they decided to get married. On January 16, 1864, they moved together to an apartment on Fleet Street. Although they didn't stay there for long, since just a few weeks later, they moved in with Mary's father, who was extremely ill. They lived in this other place for 10 years, even starting their family while they were there. In fact, 3 of their 5 children were born while they were still sharing a house with Edward. But soon the space started to feel cramped, and the couple wanted to have their own place. So in 1875, they moved again, this time to an apartment in South London, in a complex of buildings called the Peabody Buildings. There, Mary would give birth to her last 2 children, with the youngest being Henry Alfred in 1879. By that time, the relationship between her and her husband was going through an extremely difficult time. Polly had discovered, right after giving birth, that her husband was cheating on her, which caused her a deep depression that eventually pushed her into alcoholism. As if the situation wasn't enough, William decided to leave her and go live with his lover for a while, leaving Mary in charge of their 5 children. The situation didn't get better over time. Instead, it became even more tense. Mary blamed William for his affairs outside of marriage, and for his part, he claimed that alcoholism was what was ruining their marriage. Finally, the following year, the couple decided to separate, and Mary left the home, leaving 4 of her children with William, except for the eldest Edward, who went to live with his maternal grandfather. Even though they were no longer together, William was still financially responsible for Mary, according to the laws of that time, so he paid her a weekly allowance of 5 shillings, so that his ex-wife could live in a boarding house called Lambeth, located not far from the apartment where he and his children lived. Mary stayed there until May 31, 1881, when she unexpectedly left the boarding house to move in with a man whose name no one in her circle even knew. Furious, William tried to use this as an excuse to stop paying her alimony, but Mary was not willing to lose that money so easily, so she involved the authorities, who ended up siding with William. Since the argument was that she was the one who had left the family home, abandoning him and their children. The truth is that the relationship with this man didn't last very long, and Mary ended up living with her father. Meanwhile, her problem with alcohol kept getting worse, causing even her relationship with her father to suffer. Her life kept getting worse and worse. By 1888, Mary had become homeless, so she had to turn to prostitution again to support herself. Heading to the East End of London, where it was easier to find clients and where the rents were cheaper. At the time of the events, Polly, already 42 years old, was sharing a room with a woman named Nellie Holland in Whitechapel. However, on August 30th, the person who managed the inn kicked her out. She was very behind on paying the 4 shillings for the bed she occupied. Angry, Mary took her few belongings and left the room, assuring that she would be back very soon with the money. However, she never came back. Around 3:30 in the morning on August 31st, while Charles Cross, a carriage driver, was on his way to work, he noticed what appeared to be an abandoned tarp in front of the door of a horse stable located on Box Row in Whitechapel. Inevitably curious, Charles decided to get closer. Meanwhile, a colleague named Robert Paul was passing by. Still not very sure of what he was seeing, Cross called Paul to come closer as well. That's when they noticed that it wasn't a top but the body of a woman. Confused by what they had just discovered, the two drivers spent a couple of minutes discussing whether the woman they had found by chance was unconscious or dead. However, when they got a lamp to shine some light, it was clear that she was lifeless. The woman was lying on her back with her eyes open and her face beaten, as far as the two men could make out in the darkness. She had wounds on her throat and stomach. During that time, it was normal for police officers to patrol the area on foot, so Charles and Robert looked for one until they found Jonas Misson not far away, to whom they told what they had discovered while they were talking to Misson. One of his colleagues, who was walking in the opposite direction, had already found the body and had started flashing his lantern to get the attention of a third officer named John Train. The body was very close to the window of a house where Emma Green, a widow, lived with her children. Naturally, while they waited for the body to be collected, a couple of officers knocked on the door to ask the family if any of them had heard any unusual noises that night. However, neither Emma nor her 3 children said they had heard anything suspicious. In fact, not even the police officers patrolling the area had seen or heard anything. So at first, there were no clues as to who had attacked Mary or even when it had happened. At that time, the role of a forensic specialist didn't exist yet, and autopsies were carried out by surgeons, like Dr. Reese Ralph Llewellyn, who used to work with the police quite often. That day, the police requested his presence at the crime scene, and the man arrived at 4 in the morning to confirm the death of the victim, whose identity was still unknown. After a rather superficial analysis on the street, the man determined that the woman had been dead for only about half an hour. Although what really caught his attention was the small amount of blood at the scene, especially considering the number of wounds he had found on the victim. According to his report, the woman had 2 deep cuts on her throat, while in the abdominal area she had an even deeper wound, made in a zigzag shape. At the same time, she also had 4 cuts made with the same weapon on the right side of her torso. By the shape of the wounds, she estimated that the knife was between 15 and 20 centimeters long. All this information, which she initially gave verbally to the police, led them to believe that the woman had not been murdered in that place. Starting an investigation that would be led by the Metropolitan Police and specifically by officers John Sparting and Joseph Helson. Meanwhile, at the same time, the print press was starting its own investigation. Each newspaper had its own theory about what had happened. Several of them talked about a connection between the deaths of Emma and Martha and that of this third woman who had not yet been identified. The police managed to discover Mary's name thanks to her petticoats. When they examined the body in the morgue more closely, they didn't find any identification, but they did find the stamp of a petticoat factory. So they quickly went to that place where they were given the name of the woman who had bought them. Mary Nichols, an identity that was confirmed when the manager of her lodging and her ex-husband recognized her. The truth is that regarding the person responsible for the attack, the investigators were not able to obtain much information. And while they were still trying to reconstruct Mary's last hours, a new female body appeared nearby. In the early hours of the morning on September 8, 1888, John Davis, an elderly man who lived at number 29 Hanbury Street, began his daily routine. He got up a little before 6 in the morning, and after a cup of tea, he went out to his backyard to check the weather. However, instead of finding out what the morning was like, he found something terrifying. In his yard, in the space between the gate and the 3 steps that marked the back entrance of the house, lay the lifeless and severely mutilated body of a woman. Her head was facing the house, and the skirt of her dress had been pulled up to reveal her underwear. A handkerchief was tightly tied around her throat, and both her face and hands were soaked in blood. Shocked by the discovery, John went out into the street, not quite sure what he was supposed to do at that moment. His condition made two men who worked for the municipality approach to ask if he was okay. After hearing the old man's response, they quickly decided to go to the police, so they split up to look for an officer who was working in the area. While each of them was searching, one of the municipal workers, James Kent, couldn't stop the image of the sadistically murdered woman from repeating over and over in his mind. So, in an attempt to stop it, he decided to stop looking for a police officer. And instead, he stopped at an open bar to order a strong drink. His colleague, Henry Holland, on the other hand, hurried to get to Commercial Street, a busier place where there were almost always police officers patrolling on foot. And that day was no exception. After a few minutes of searching, Henry found an officer to whom he nervously told everything that had happened, but the officer seemed to pay no attention to what Henry was saying. In fact, he refused to leave his post, saying he had orders not to leave that street. Fortunately, while Henry, indignant, argued with the police officer, John Davis, he had arrived breathless at the police station, which was farther down the same street, and breathlessly demanded to see the chief, telling him what had happened. Just a few minutes later, he and Detective Joseph Chandler quickly set out for Davis's house, where a group of curious onlookers had already begun to gather after hearing rumors about what was happening. Chandler knew he wouldn't be able to work with so many people around, so he called for reinforcements to keep the onlookers back. And in addition, he requested the presence of Dr. George Baxter Phillips, another surgeon who worked with the police. The expert arrived at the crime scene around 6:30 and soon realized that his presence there didn't make much sense. The victim was, without a doubt, dead, so he couldn't do anything other than officially pronounce her death, and order that her body be taken to Whitechapel Workhouse Infirmary, where the morgue was operating at that time. According to what the doctor determined in that first analysis, the cause of the woman's death was extremely similar to that of Mary Nichols. 2 deep cuts that went from left to right across her body, but that wasn't the only similarity. Just like in the first case, this woman had her entire abdomen mutilated, something the doctor emphasized before leaving the scene to prepare her admission to the morgue. Detective Chandler and several other officers stayed at the scene, discovering several personal items that seemed to belong to the victim. First, they found 2 pills very close to where the body had been. And in that same area, they also found a small piece of a torn envelope, a piece of frayed fabric, and a comb. Objects that, although they seemed unimportant, were essential when it came to identifying the victim. Thanks to the testimony of John Davis, they learned that it was quite common to see the woman in that area. So they immediately started asking around the area to find out who knew her, or if at least someone had seen her the night before. These almost massive interrogations allowed the authorities to learn that at least 2 men had seen her at 1:50 in the morning. The victim, who had told one of them that she didn't have enough money on her to pay for the night at the shelter where she lived. Her testimony was not only important because it indicated from what time the woman could have been murdered, but also because, in addition, she gave the name of the woman, Annie Chapman, allowing the police to contact her family to confirm her identity. According to what the officers were able to find out about her, Annie was 47 years old at the time of her death, and since she was practically a child, she had an addiction to alcohol, which throughout her life had caused her various problems, including her divorce, which had happened 2 years before the murder. Trying to start over, Annie had decided to leave Paddington, the central area of London where she had lived since she was born, and instead settle in Whitechapel, a much more affordable place for a separated woman who supported herself through various manual jobs. She did crochet and made different types of upholstery for armchairs, which were very fashionable at that time. She also sold flowers, and when all that wasn't enough, she turned to prostitution as a way to get quick money. This was recorded in the judicial investigation that began a few days later, in which the progress of the investigation was presented before Judge Baxter. During these hearings, her autopsy report was read publicly for the first time, which shocked the press even more and later the public. Annie's abdomen had been completely opened, with precise incisions. However, her internal organs had been manipulated in a gruesome way. Her intestines were completely stretched over her body and had been placed on one of her shoulders, while her uterus had been completely removed from her body. And it was not found. This last detail caused different reactions and the emergence of various theories. Judge Baxter, for example, proposed the hypothesis that Annie had been killed solely because her attacker wanted to remove her uterus. But even though it was investigated, this possibility was quickly ruled out. Unlike another theory that emerged at the same time, the one that suggested the perpetrator had medical knowledge, which explained the almost perfect way in which Annie Chapman's abdomen had been opened. As expected, the news of the discovery of a second lifeless woman in the Whitechapel area, with wounds very similar to those of the first one. It quickly became breaking news in all the city's media outlets. From the very beginning, the media followed the development of the investigation and also the trial, putting even more pressure on the London police. At the same time, they generated even more fear among the population, who read every day not only the gruesome details of Annie's and Mary's deaths, but also all kinds of theories about who was responsible. On September 24th, the final day of the judicial inquiry into Annie's death, Sir Charles Warren, Chief of the London Metropolitan Police, received an anonymous letter that was supposedly written by the murderer. It says, "Dear Sir, I wish to turn myself in. I have nightmares every night and I feel miserable. I am the one who committed all the murders of the last 6 months. I am a killer of prostitutes. I found the woman I wanted on Chapman and did to her what I call dismembering. This is the knife I used to commit the murders." This last sentence was found beneath a drawing of a knife, which was accompanied by a drawing of a coffin. Although the letter was certainly troubling, it wasn't the first time the police had received that kind of note regarding popular cases like that one. So, after reading it a couple of times, Charles Warren and his team decided not to give it any importance. They were convinced that it was someone seeking attention and not the killer himself. If the person who wrote the first letter was the same one who sent one to the National Central News Agency 3 days later, we can't know. But September 27th marked a turning point in the case. The first 2 media outlets to which this letter was sent completely ignored it. The third decided to share it with the Metropolitan Police. With a mocking tone, the letter said, "Dear boss, I keep hearing that the police caught me, but they still haven't. I laugh when I see them talk so cleverly, talking about being on the right track to catch me. I'm against prostitutes, and I'm not going to stop ripping them up until they catch me." The creepiest thing about this letter was the details it gave about his modus operandi, and the promise that he would cut off the ears of his next victim to prove that it was really him who was ending the lives of the victims. What became most popular about this letter wasn't that, but the signature. Unlike the first one, this second letter had a sender, Jack the Ripper, the name by which people would start referring to the killer. This letter wasn't made public until the morning of October 1st, along with the news of a third murder. Elizabeth Stride, originally from Sweden, was 44 years old when her life came to an abrupt end. Her friends called her Long Liz. Liz, because of her height. This woman had been working as a prostitute since she was young, being registered in the Sex Workers Registry of Gothenburg, which was her hometown. At that time, she had just turned 20 years old in 1878. After separating from her husband, Stride moved to a shelter in Whitechapel, where she started working as a seamstress and cleaner, although she soon returned to her old job, occasionally having legal issues, for being found drunk in public on several occasions. Despite this, the various friends she made while living in London described her as a woman with a calm character, with her biggest problem being drinking. Unlike the other victims, Elizabeth had been living in the same place for 6 years, without any mishaps or conflicts with other guests or with partners. Her main job had become housekeeping, and her routine was almost always the same. After finishing her work at 6:30, she would head to Queen's Head Pub, a place located in the center of Whitechapel. September 30th was no different. Liz went to that bar and stayed there for about half an hour before heading back. At home, she spoke with Charles Preston, one of the other guests, and asked to borrow his clothes brush to remove lint from her outfit. According to what Charles would say later, Liz returned the brush to him shortly after, and around 7:30 she went out again, even though it was raining heavily. Later that same night, some workers saw her in another pub, where she was accompanied by a gentleman who wasn't very tall and was wearing morning clothes. He wore a bowler hat and had an unusual mustache. Liz seemed to be delighted with the man, but to these two workers, his appearance and the way he acted seemed strange. So before leaving, they approached the woman to warn her that this was Mandil de Cuero, a nickname that until then had been given to the murderer. The woman completely ignored them and ended up leaving the place with the man. It was past 11:30 when they left that bar, heading towards Commercial Road and Barnard Street. During the next hour, several people saw her in the company of this man, who even bought grapes from a street vendor to share while they kissed. At some point between the last time the couple was seen, at 12:35 and 1 in the morning, things stopped being romantic. Louis Dimschatz, the manager of a nearby social club, left work in a horse-drawn carriage. He had barely crossed the courtyard of the place when the animal suddenly stopped. So, a little confused, Louise got out of the carriage and looked for what had scared the horse, finding Liz's lifeless body. According to reports from that time, the woman had just been murdered and blood was still flowing from the wound on her neck. This shocked the man so much that he ended up screaming in horror, alerting both the neighbors and those still at the club, who quickly came over to find out what had happened. The police arrived at the scene quickly and noticed that, although the victim's profile matched the Jack the Ripper murders, a very special characteristic element was missing. Liz didn't have any cuts on her abdomen, and therefore the killer hadn't been able to rearrange or even play with her organs as in the previous cases. The authorities soon came to the conclusion that someone had interrupted him in the middle of the process he had for killing the victims. And before being discovered, the killer fled, leaving his work half done. This theory was confirmed just an hour later, when the police received a second call about the discovery of a second body, not far from the area where they were. It was another woman who worked in sex work, identified as Catherine Eddowes. Also known as Kate, this 46-year-old woman was often described by her friends as not only beautiful, but also very intelligent, although she also had a volatile personality. The owner of the lodging house where she lived in 1888 said that she seemed to be a woman who was always cheerful and singing. In addition to making a living through prostitution, Kate also did various extra jobs. In the summers, for example, she and a friend used to go to Kunt to work in the hop harvest, which earned her a considerable amount of money. However, the woman would spend it very quickly when she returned to London, so she had to go back to prostitution. By the last days of September, there were only pennies left to share between her and her friend. With what was left, Catherine made sure to pay for a bed at Shulin Casual World and checked in as a guest. She said that she had returned to London with the idea of catching the killer and claiming the reward that the authorities were offering. She said she was convinced she knew who Jack the Ripper was. In response to these statements, the innkeeper suggested that she be careful so that, in her attempt to catch the killer, he wouldn't end up taking her life. Now without money, on September 29th, Kate had to pawn her boots, and with what she got for them, she bought tea and sugar to ease her hunger. Although the money she was given was so little that after that purchase, she had nothing left. So she decided to travel to the district where her daughter lived to ask her for money. She returned to La Posada in the afternoon and stayed there until around 7. What did she do between that time and 8 in the evening? We don't know, but by that time, Kate was drunk and lying on the floor at number 29 Aldergate High Street. So a police officer passing by decided to take her to the station where she was held in a cell until about 12:55 on September 30th, when the officers released her because she was already sober. She ended up leaving there at 1 in the morning and walked in the opposite direction of what would have been her home. Instead, she took another street, Aldergate High Street, probably with the intention of continuing to get drunk in the area. About half an hour later, 3 men saw her talking to a man in front of Church Passage near what is known as Mitre Square, very close to the Great Synagogue of London. Less than 10 minutes after these people saw her with a companion, a police officer named Watkins entered the square to do his patrol. That's when he saw the woman's body lying face up, surrounded by a huge amount of blood and with her clothes pulled up. Unlike Elizabeth with Catherine, the killer had enough time to make a deep cut in her throat, but also to make a deep cut in her abdomen, through which he had pulled out the intestine, placing it over her left shoulder, as he had done with previous victims. However, with Catherine, he had gone even further. And when the surgeon examined her, he found that the killer had taken her left kidney and almost her entire uterus. Thus, a new judicial investigation was opened for these 2 cases, but the truth is that no solid clues were found that could point to the killer. However, the day after the events and the publication of Jack the Ripper's letter, the Central News Agency received a new letter in which the sender claimed to be the killer of Kate and Liz. Referring to the murders as a double event, the postcard reached the press even before the police report on these 2 deaths. So it was impossible for the sender to have gathered information about them through the press. However, the police managed to prove that this letter was actually a forgery, done by a journalist. What was genuine, however, was the package received by the director of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, George Lusk, on October 16, 1888. Inside the package was half of a human kidney and a letter that has popularly been called From Hell, because of the use of that same phrase in this letter, where the author claimed to have fried and eaten half of it. Missing from the kidney, which was confirmed, of course, to be of human origin, and it was even a left kidney. The press took this confirmation even further and said it was the kidney of a 45-year-old woman, although in reality there was no way to know that much. At the same time, many involved in the investigation confirmed that it matched perfectly with the kidney that Kate was missing. During the following weeks, after the package was sent and the double event, things seemed to calm down. Until November 9th, when the 5th and last confirmed victim of this killer appeared. Mary Jane Kelly was conventionally attractive. Although physical descriptions of her tend to vary, they all agree that she was a very beautiful woman. Beyond this, we know very little about her. According to her partner at the time, Mary was Irish and was born in 1863. Although she had lived in Wales since she was a child, she only moved to London 4 years before her death. According to what that man said, Mary was illiterate and had married very young to a coal miner named John Davis, who died just 3 years after the wedding due to an explosion in the mine where he worked. She lived with one of her cousins in Cardiff before deciding to move in 1884. She traveled to London, where she initially stayed with the nuns at Providence Road Night Refuge, where she stayed for a while in exchange for doing cleaning tasks, until she found a job at a shop on Cleveland Street. However, she didn't stay long at that place, choosing instead to work at a high-class brothel located in the West End, where she made much more money than working at a shop. But soon, the work began to wear her down, and Mary ended up developing an addiction to alcohol, which led to her being fired. Mary then turned to occasional prostitution on her own, and she was actually doing quite a bit better than the other victims. Let's remember that she was 20 years younger than the others, and that allowed her to have a larger number of clients. They also had more money, and therefore didn't need to prostitute themselves on the street. The night of Thursday, November 8th, was one of those nights when she was looking for clients to earn money, but unfortunately, instead of doing so, she found death. Around 10:45 on Friday the 9th, the administration of Miller's Court began to check the rooms, and when they entered one, they found Mary lifeless on the bed. She had a deep cut that went from her throat to her spine. Her whole face was disfigured, completely destroyed. and her entire abdomen had been opened with all the organs removed, including the heart. It was the most grotesque and disturbing crime committed up to that point, because in addition to the horrors committed, she was followed by a deathly silence from the murderer, who had previously shown a taste for writing to the authorities. And what's even stranger is that it was the last murder with those characteristics. By the time Mary's body was found, Scotland Yard already had about 100 of its officers investigating the murders. And although the press criticized that what was happening wasn't being taken seriously, the truth is that the authorities carried out an extremely thorough investigation for that time. Every day, dozens of police officers were assigned to question witnesses and neighbors from the different locations where the bodies had been found. At the same time, they were examining everything with the most advanced technology available at that time, which wasn't much, but they tried anyway. In total, 2,000 statements were taken, thanks to which a list of 300 suspects was created, out of which 80 were arrested. But none of them turned out to be Jack. Among the efforts made by Scotland Yard, there were things never seen before, such as the creation of a psychological profile of the killer, a tool that is now used quite often. This innovation was carried out by the forensic doctor Thomas Bond, who, after analyzing all the information available about the murders, put together a profile of the person responsible. Unlike the popular hypothesis proposed by other colleagues, Thomas believed the killer lacked any scientific or anatomical education. Given the way he made the cuts, the doctor dared to suggest that Jack actually had technical knowledge, similar to those of a butcher. In addition to this, he added that it was probably a lonely man who suffered from periodic attacks of homicidal or erotic mania, which could be inferred from the mutilations he inflicted on his victims. Finally, in the report, Thomas pointed out that his motivations could have arisen from a mental disorder or from a feeling of revenge or melancholy. He even went so far as to say that maybe it was due to a religious mania, and that was why he attacked prostitutes, considering them sinners. For him, it was obvious that it was a single individual behind the murders, and not a group of people, as some theories claimed. There is no doubt that the 5 murders were committed by the same hand. In the first 4, the throats appear to have been cut from left to right, and in the last one, due to the extensive mutilation. It's impossible to say in which direction the fatal cut was made, although arterial blood was found splattered on the wall near where the woman's head must have been. The circumstances surrounding the murders lead me to deduce that the women were lying down at the time they were killed. And in all cases, the killer cut the throat first. Thanks to your report, the list of suspects kept getting smaller and smaller, until it ended up with 6 individuals. These individuals, even to this day, are considered the most likely to have been the killer. The first of these men to be considered one of the most likely suspects was Aaron Kosminski, a name that Robert Anderson, who was the director of the Criminal Investigation Department at that time, suggested. He was convinced that the murderer was Aaron, a Jewish barber of Polish origin who had emigrated to London in 1882, and he was known in Whitechapel for being a person with a mental instability that bordered on madness. The director's conviction led to his arrest in 1888, and he remained in prison until 2 years later, when Scotland Yard found a witness who claimed to have seen him accompanying one of the victims before the events. Convinced, that witness confirmed his identity upon seeing him, but later regretted it, leaving the authorities with no evidence against the barber, so they had no choice but to release him. In 2014, the writer Russell Edwards said he had conducted a DNA test on one of the pieces of clothing belonging to Catherine, and he compared it with a sample obtained from the barber's descendants. According to him, the test showed a match between the traces found on the garment and the descendants of Aaron. So he claimed to have solved the case, stating that Kosminski was the killer. However, most forensic experts and people interested in this case believe that this is not enough evidence, because it's not known for sure if the garment analyzed actually belonged to Catherine, and if it did, it's likely that it reached the writer extremely contaminated. So many people don't consider it a reliable conclusion. Another suspect came from a much more luxurious background. It was the young lawyer Montague John Druitt, known for being from a rather prestigious upper-class family in the city. He was considered one of the main suspects by Melville McNagden, one of the lead investigators on the case, who regarded the lawyer as someone sexually ill, which at the time was used to refer to homosexual people. This was also the reason why he had been fired from his job in the fall of 1888, which, together with the investigator's harassment, led the detective to become a murderer. A week after the last murder, which for the detective made him undoubtedly the killer. However, his own colleagues believed that this theory didn't make sense. He had no evidence against him, and there didn't seem to be a clear motive to believe that the lawyer was responsible for the crimes. More than just prejudice. The third suspect was a well-known figure in London at that time. Walter Sickert, a 28-year-old painter who was investigated by the police because of his excessive interest in the case. In fact, he even painted an oil painting about the scene of the last crime titled Jack the Ripper's Bedroom, even though at the time of the investigation no clear evidence was found against him. In 2014, a mitochondrial DNA match was found between a letter sent by Walter's wife and one of the letters sent by Jack. However, this also cannot be considered conclusive evidence, since 10% of the English population shares the type of DNA that matched. The next suspect was John Picer, a Jewish shoemaker who was popularly known as Leather Apron because of his trade. Scotland Yard's attention focused on him after the murder of Mary Ann Nichols, the second victim, because another prostitute reported to the police that she had been threatened with a knife by this man that night. When they checked his record, they discovered that it wasn't the first time he had had an altercation with prostitutes, and that raised more suspicions about the shoemaker who was arrested and interrogated in a very uncivilized way, trying to force a confession out of him, but they couldn't. The man stuck firmly to his alibi. One of the most well-known suspects was, without a doubt, Alberto Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria of England and Duke of Clarence. This member of the royal family died very young, at 28 years old, 4 years after the Jack the Ripper murders. According to a little confirmed theory, Alberto was investigated by Scotland Yard, which believed that the Duke had the complicity of the Queen's doctor. Despite this, they were never questioned and the hypothesis was forgotten. Until 1976, when the writer Stephen Knight published his own book about the case, where he claims that the murders and the figure of Jack the Ripper were the work of the monarchy to protect the Duke, since, according to him, Alberto was a regular client of the Whitechapel prostitutes and had even had a daughter with one of them. The mother of his daughter and her friends, who were also prostitutes, had started to blackmail him to keep the truth from coming out, and to prevent the situation from dragging on, the Crown would have killed the women and created a fictional serial killer to protect the Duke. Of course, there is no clear evidence that he or the doctor committed the crimes, or even that the theory could be real. The investigation never reached a conclusion, and for more than a century, the mystery continued and still continues to this day, attracting the attention of thousands of people around the world, who wonder what happened to this killer and who was he really. Every so often, different conspiracy theories about his identity come up, or why he disappeared overnight without leaving a trace. Despite advances in technology and new forensic techniques, this case remains unsolved to this day. It is, without a doubt, one of the greatest mysteries in human history. In February of this year, 2025, Russell Edwards presented the results of his tests again, insisting that Aaron Kosminski was the killer. However, his evidence is not official, and therefore, until Scotland Yard makes a statement on the matter, his results cannot be confirmed, are authentic. To this day, we still don't know who Jack the Ripper was, and it's likely that we will never know. And well, that's it for the video. Tell me what you think. I'm sure you know about the case, but this was just to refresh your memory and clarify a couple of things. Because a few months ago, people started saying that the identity of Shaggy the Ripper had been discovered. And that's not true. I mean, it's not real. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But since all this evidence is from so long ago, we'll probably never have a conclusive result. You can believe whatever you want. For me, we're never gonna know for sure what really happened. So here are the Patreons and the channel members. Thank you for supporting me through those means. That's all for now. Check out the recommended video, subscribe by clicking on my face, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.